The girl was already talking before she reached him, her voice pitched high and slow like she was addressing a child or a dog. "Sir, excuse me, sir. You know you can sit down if you want to watch the ceremony, right? There are seats in the back for anyone who wants to attend." Earl Whitmore did not look up from the hedge. His hands, weathered and scarred across the knuckles, continued their work with the precision of a man who had spent 50 years making every movement count. The electric trimmer hummed its steady rhythm as he shaped the boxwood into clean lines, the same clean lines he had maintained for 22 years along this stretch of the Whitfield University quad. The girl stepped closer. She wore a lanyard with a badge that read Veteran Support Club, and beneath that, in smaller letters, Madison Shunn, President. Her smile was the kind that expected gratitude. "Sir," she raised her voice another notch, "the ceremony is about to start. We have a really amazing speaker this year, a retired colonel who served in Afghanistan. I just thought, someone like you might appreciate it. Someone like him." Earl let the words pass through him the way he had let 1,000 small cuts pass through him over the years. He clicked off the trimmer and straightened slowly, his spine protesting the movement with the familiar ache of old shrapnel working its way through muscle and bone. When he turned to face her, his eyes were calm and dark and carried something in their depths that the girl would not recognize until it was far too late. "That is very kind of you," he said. His voice was quiet, the words measured out like ammunition can serve for a long patrol. "I can see fine from here." The girl's smile flickered with something that might have been confusion or might have been the particular discomfort of someone whose charity has been politely declined. She glanced back at the rows of white, folding chairs, at the small stage draped in red, white, and blue bunting, at the memorial wall of black granite that rose behind the podium like a shadow given permanent form. "But do you not want to hear the speeches?" She was trying again, her tone dropping into what she clearly believed was compassion. "We are honoring veterans today. Real heroes. I just thought maybe you had a father or a grandfather who served, and you might want to, I do not know, feel connected to their sacrifice." Earl's hand moved to his pocket. A small gesture, unconscious, the way a man might touch a photograph or a letter or a medal he had carried every Veterans Day for half a century. His fingers found the worn velvet of the case and rested there. "I appreciate the thought," he said. Behind them, the ceremony was beginning. A young woman in ROTC dress uniform approached the microphone to deliver the opening remarks. The crowd of 200 settled into their seats. Faculty in academic regalia filled the front row. Students who had wandered over out of curiosity or course credit clustered near the back. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, you might want to know that moments like these happen more often than you think. In every town, in every city, there are men and women who carry their service quietly, who trim hedges and drive buses and stock shelves while the weight of what they have seen and done settles deeper into their bones with every passing year. If you're joining us from somewhere far from this university quad, take a moment to drop a comment and tell us where you are. Because the truth is, you might have a quiet hero in your own neighborhood, someone whose weathered hands and humble work hide a story that would bring you to your knees. Madison was still standing there, her clipboard pressed against her chest. She had not moved. Something about the old groundskeeper unsettled her in a way she could not name, some quality in his stillness that did not match the picture she had constructed in her mind. The speaker at the podium, the retired Colonel Madison, had mentioned, cleared his throat, and began. "Today we gather to honor those who answered the call, those who left everything behind. And I want to tell you about one battle in particular, a battle that defined a generation of soldiers. The Battle of Hamburger Hill." Earl's hands stopped moving. The trimmer hung at his side, silent now. His eyes, which had been fixed on some middle distance only he could see, shifted to the speaker. Madison noticed the change. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a stage whisper. "Do you know about Hamburger Hill? It was in Vietnam. Really brutal. Those poor soldiers had to climb this mountain over and over while the enemy just, shot down at them. Can you imagine?" Earl said nothing, but something in his posture had shifted. Something had pulled tight across his shoulders and jaw, And if Madison had known what to look for, she would have seen the 1,000-yard stare settling over his features like a mask he had worn 10,000 times before. The speaker continued. 11 assaults over 10 days. Some of the bravest men who ever wore the uniform fought and died on that hill. And there is one story in particular I want to share with you today. The story of a sergeant they called Shepard. Earl's hand tightened around the trimmer. His knuckles went white. Madison was still talking, oblivious. She had pulled out her phone and was scrolling through photographs. Look, these are from our fundraiser last month. We raised almost $3,000 for veteran housing. She turned the screen toward Earl, showing him image after image of herself posing with elderly men in veteran caps, her smile bright and practiced in every frame. I have met so many amazing veterans through this work. Real heroes, you know, men who actually served. Earl looked at the photographs. He looked at the girl's eager face. He looked at the memorial wall behind her, at the names carved into black granite, at one name in particular in the section marked Operation Iraqi Freedom that she had not thought to notice. Then he looked back at the speaker, who was describing the shepherd of Hamburger Hill, the sergeant who had carried 4 wounded men and 1 dead friend down a mountain in the dark, while enemy fire tore the jungle apart around him. What the girl did not know, what no one at this ceremony knew except for one history professor now making his way to his seat with a growing sense of impossible recognition, was that in exactly 20 minutes, everything she thought she understood about service and sacrifice and quiet heroism would shatter into 1,000 pieces. And the old groundskeeper with the scarred hands and the worn velvet case in his pocket would become the most important person she had ever met. But for now, Earl simply nodded at her photographs and said, in that same quiet voice, "That is good work you are doing." And he turned back to the hedge, his hands steady, his eyes fixed on a hill half a world and half a century away, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally climb down from the mountain. The smell hit him first. It always did. Cordite and wet earth and something copper-sweet that never washed out of memory, no matter how many years passed or how many showers a man took or how many times he told himself it was over, it was done, it was half a century ago. Earl's hands kept moving on the hedge, but his mind was somewhere else now, somewhere green and vertical and filled with the sound of men screaming. May 1969. Zong Ap Bia. The locals called it the Mountain of the Crouching Beast. The Americans would call it Hamburger Hill because that is what it did to them, ground them up and spit them out assault after assault until the jungle floor was more blood than mud. He had been 23 years old. Staff Sergeant Earl Whitmore, 2nd Squad, 3rd Platoon, 101st Airborne Division. They called him Shepard because he always brought his men back. Every patrol, every firefight, every midnight insertion into territory that was supposed to be cleared but never was. Shepard gets them home, they said. Shepard never loses a man. Until he did. Jimmy Dalton was on point that morning. Corporal James Dalton from Beaumont, Texas, 21 years old. A kid who could field strip an M16 blindfolded and who kept a photograph of his girl back home tucked inside his helmet liner. Jimmy had a laugh like a car backfiring and a way of making everyone around him believe they were going to survive even when the math said otherwise. Shepard is going to get us home, Jimmy said that morning as they started up the hill for the 11th time. He said it like a prayer. He said it like a fact. He said it with that grin that made Earl believe it too, even though the jungle above them was a solid wall of muzzle flash, and the radio operator was already calling coordinates for an extraction that would never come. The smell of diesel cut through the memory. Earl blinked. The university quad reassembled itself around him. The white chairs and the bunting and the girl with the clipboard who was still talking, still showing him photographs, still explaining something about donation drives and awareness campaigns. And the really amazing thing, Madison was saying, is that most of these veterans have never told their stories. They just, suffer in silence. It is so sad. Earl looked at her. He looked at the speaker on the stage who was still describing Hamburger Hill in the broad strokes of someone who had read about it, but never smelled it. He looked at the memorial wall where the names of the dead waited in black granite silence. Jimmy's name was not on that wall. Jimmy's body had come home to Beaumont in a flag-draped box, and his mother had screamed so loud at the funeral that Earl could still hear it some nights when the dreams got bad. Jimmy was buried in a small cemetery with live oaks and Spanish moss, and a headstone that said "Beloved Son," and nothing about the hill or the 11 assaults or the moment when the RPG came through the tree and took everything. "Do you have anyone?" Madison asked. She had put her phone away and was studying Earl with the expression of someone conducting field research. "Family who served, I mean. A lot of people your age had fathers in Korea or World War II. Earl considered the question. He considered telling her about his father, who had landed at Normandy and never spoke a word about it until the day he died. He considered telling her about his son, whose name was carved into the granite behind her, whose boots Earl had polished the morning he shipped out to Iraq, and whose folded flag sat on Earl's mantle in a house that was too quiet and too empty. "A few," he said instead. The speaker's voice rose over the crowd. "And on the 10th day, with casualties mounting and extraction impossible, one sergeant made a decision that would define the meaning of brotherhood. With 4 wounded soldiers unable to walk and his best friend bleeding out from shrapnel wounds, Staff Sergeant Whitmore began the impossible descent." Earl's jaw tightened. He had not heard his own name spoken aloud in this context for decades. The university had never known. The Postal Service, where he worked for 30 years after the war, had never known. His wife had known, God rest her, and she had held him through the nightmares and never once asked him to explain. The speaker continued. 14 hours, 800 meters of vertical jungle. Enemy fire the entire way. And Sergeant Whitmore refused to leave anyone behind. Not the living, not the dead. Madison perked up. She turned toward the stage with renewed interest. "Wow," she said. "That is incredible. Can you imagine being that brave?" Earl said nothing. He was back on the mountain now, feeling the weight of Jimmy's body across his shoulders, the wet heat of blood soaking through his fatigues, the burning in his legs that screamed at him to stop, to rest, to leave the dead and save himself. He had not stopped. He had not rested. He had carried all 5 of them down that mountain in the dark, navigating by starlight and memory and the sound of Jimmy's voice in his head saying Shepard gets them home. For men had lived because of that night. For men had gone home to wives and children and lives that stretched out across decades. They sent him letters sometimes, Christmas cards with photographs of grandchildren. One of them, a kid named Rodriguez who had taken shrapnel in both legs, had become a high school principal in Arizona. He wrote to Earl every year on the anniversary. "Still here because of you," the letters always said. Never forgotten. Jimmy had not lived. Jimmy had died somewhere around the 4-hour mark, his breath rattling out in a long sigh while Earl begged him to hold on just a little longer. But Earl had carried him anyway, all the way down, because Shepard never left anyone behind. The speaker was wrapping up the Hamburger Hill portion of his address now, moving on to other wars, other heroes, other sacrifices. But in the front row, a man in a tweed jacket had stopped listening. Professor David Okonkwo was staring at the groundskeeper with an expression of dawning recognition, his mind racing through 3 decades of research and one particular photograph that hung on his office wall. Madison touched Earl's arm. He flinched. The contact was unexpected, unwelcome, a breach of the careful distance he had maintained between himself and the world for 50 years. "Sorry," she said, pulling back. "I just wanted to say, if you ever want to come to one of our meetings, we would love to have you. We are always looking for, community members who want to support our veterans." Earl looked at her hand, at the place where she had touched him. He thought about the last person who had touched him with kindness. His wife, 3 years ago, her fingers cool against his forehead as the hospital machines beeped their steady countdown. "That is very kind," he said. And somewhere in the front row, Professor Okonkwo was pulling out his phone, searching for an image he had looked at 1,000 times, comparing it to the face of the old man with the hedge trimmer, and feeling his hands begin to shake. Madison had not finished. She had, in fact, only just begun. "You know what really gets me?" she said, shifting her weight from one foot to the other in the manner of someone settling in for a lecture. "Most people have no idea what these veterans went through. Like none at all. They just see some old guy on the street, and they do not even think about the fact that he might have, trauma or whatever. Earl resumed trimming the hedge. The blades sang their high mechanical song as he shaped the boxwood with movements that betrayed nothing of the memories still churning beneath the surface of his calm. I took a class on it last semester, Madison continued. The psychology of combat veterans. Did you know that most of them never talk about what they saw? They just bottle all up inside, and it destroys them. It is really tragic when you think about it. The irony was not lost on Earl. 50 years of bottled silence stood 3 feet from this girl, and she could not see it, could not sense it, could not imagine that the man with the hedge trimmer and the dirt under his fingernails might carry more weight in his pocket than all her textbooks and seminars and awareness campaigns combined. Tragic, he agreed quietly. The ceremony had moved on from Hamburger Hill. The retired colonel was speaking now about the importance of community support, about the ways ordinary citizens could make a difference in the lives of those who had served. His words washed over the crowd in practiced waves, hitting all the right notes of gratitude and obligation. Near the back of the seating area, a young man in ROTC dress uniform had stopped watching the stage. Tommy Reeves stood with his hands clasped behind his back in the position of parade rest, but his eyes were fixed on the exchange happening near the hedgerow. Something about the old groundskeeper had caught his attention. The way the man held himself, the economy of his movements, the particular stillness that settled over him when the speaker had mentioned Hamburger Hill. Tommy's grandfather had served in Vietnam, had come home with a Bronze Star and a 1,000-yard stare and a drinking problem that lasted until the day he died. He never talked about the war, but sometimes when he did not know anyone was watching, he would get that same look in his eyes, that same stillness, like part of him was still over there, still fighting, still trying to find his way back. The groundskeeper had that look now. Madison was pulling out her phone again. She had found something she wanted to share. "Look at this," she said, angling the screen toward Earl. "This is from our Instagram. We did this whole campaign about invisible veterans. The ones who are homeless or struggling or whatever. We got like 2,000 likes." Earl glanced at the screen. He saw photographs of young people in matching T-shirts, holding signs with slogans about supporting heroes. He saw smiling faces and hashtags, and the particular performance of compassion that required an audience to have meaning. "Very nice," he said. "The thing is," Madison said, lowering her voice as if sharing a confidence, "most people just walk right past these guys without even seeing them. They are invisible, and that is what we are trying to change. We want people to actually see veterans, to recognize their sacrifice." Earl set down the trimmer. He turned to face her fully for the first time, and something in his expression made her take a half step backward without understanding why. "And what does that look like?" he asked. "Seeing them." Madison blinked. She had not expected the question. "Well," she said, fumbling for the answer she had given in countless presentations and donor meetings. "It means acknowledging their service, thanking them for their sacrifice, making sure they know that we appreciate what they did for our country." Earl nodded slowly. His hand drifted to his pocket again, fingers brushing the velvet case that held 50 years of weight. "And if they do not want to be thanked," he said, "if they just want to trim a hedge in peace, what then?" The question hung in the November air. Madison's smile faltered. She was not accustomed to resistance, not from the demographic she had assigned this man to in her mind. The elderly were supposed to be grateful for attention. They were supposed to appreciate the effort. "I just meant," she started, but Earl had already turned back to the hedge. The conversation, such as it was, had ended. His hands resumed their work with the same steady precision, the same careful attention to line and form that had defined every task he had undertaken since the day he learned that discipline was the only thing standing between a man and the chaos that wanted to swallow him whole. In the front row, Professor Okonkwo had found the photograph on his phone. His hands were trembling as he zoomed in on the face of the young sergeant in the image, comparing it to the profile of the old man 50 yards away. The shape of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the way he held his head slightly tilted, as if perpetually listening for something no one else could hear. It was impossible. It was absurd. The Shepherd of Hamburger Hill was a legend, a name whispered in military history courses and officer training programs. David had written an entire chapter about him in his book on Vietnam War heroism. He had corresponded with 3 of the 4 survivors, had interviewed them about the night they were carried down a mountain by a man who refused to let them die. Not once in all those interviews had anyone mentioned that Shepard still lived in this town, that he had taken a job as a groundskeeper at a small university, that he spent his days trimming hedges and tending gardens while the world forgot the things he had done. David rose from his seat. His wife touched his arm, a question in her eyes, but he shook his head and began moving through the crowd toward the hedgerow, toward the impossible, toward a man he had spent half his career studying. Without ever knowing, he passed him every morning on the way to his office. Madison was still standing near Earl, her clipboard clutched against her chest, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and wounded pride. She did not understand what had just happened. She did not understand why her kindness had been met with something that felt almost like dismissal. But Tommy Reeves understood. He had started moving too, drawn by the same instinct that had made him join ROTC in the first place, the same pull towards service and sacrifice that ran in his blood whether he wanted it to or not. His grandfather had never talked about Vietnam, but his grandfather had also never stopped serving, had spent his last years volunteering at the VA hospital, had died with a folded flag on his chest, in a room full of men who owed him their lives. The groundskeeper had that same quality, that same quiet weight, and Tommy needed to know why. The ceremony continued. The speaker spoke. The crowd listened, and 3 people converged on an old man with a hedge trimmer, each carrying questions that would change everything they thought they knew about heroism and silence and the price of carrying others home. The hill had no mercy. It took what it wanted and gave nothing back. Earl could feel it now, the way he always felt it when the memories broke through the walls he had spent 50 years building. The gradient of the slope beneath his boots, the wet slap of elephant grass against his fatigues, the weight of a man across his shoulders, dead weight, the kind that gets heavier with every step because the person carrying it knows there is no point, knows the breathing has stopped, knows that what he is carrying is no longer his friend, but only the shell his friend left behind. Jimmy had stopped breathing somewhere around the 4-hour mark. Earl had known at the moment it happened, had felt the subtle shift in the body draped across his back, the release of tension that comes when a soul departs and leaves only meat and bone behind. He had not stopped walking. He had not set Jimmy down. He had adjusted his grip and kept moving through the darkness while the jungle screamed with gunfire and the 4 wounded men behind him struggled to keep pace. Rodriguez had been the worst. Both legs torn up by shrapnel, barely conscious, dragging himself forward on his elbows because his legs would not work and he refused to be left behind. Earl had gone back for him twice during that descent, had hoisted him onto his hip like a child and carried him until his arms gave out, then set him down and gone back for the others. Hawkins, Pemberton, Yates, Rodriguez, for men who should have died on that mountain. For men who lived because Earl Whitmore decided that Shepard gets them home was not just a saying, but a covenant, a promise written in blood and sweat, and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that only combat can forge. And Jimmy who had taken the round meant for Earl. Jimmy who had stepped left when he should have stepped right, who had put his body between his sergeant and the RPG that came screaming out of the tree line. Jimmy who had looked up at Earl with something like peace in his eyes and said, "Get them down, Shepard." All of them. Earl had carried him down, all the way down. 800 meters of vertical jungle with a dead man on his back and 4 broken soldiers in his wake. 14 hours of darkness and gunfire and the certain knowledge that he was going to die on this mountain, that they were all going to die, that the extraction would never come and the ammunition would run out and the jungle would swallow them whole. But it had not. The extraction had come at dawn, a medevac helicopter that materialized out of the morning mist like a promise kept. Earl had loaded the wounded first, then Jimmy, then himself. He had collapsed on the floor of the helicopter and watched the hill recede beneath him and felt nothing at all. The nothing had lasted for months, years, decades. He had come home to a country that did not want him, had married a woman who loved him anyway, had raised a son who looked at him with hero worship in his eyes and asked questions. Earl, could never answer. He had worked at the post office for 30 years, sorting letters and packages with the same methodical precision he had used to navigate that mountain. He had retired and taken a job as a groundskeeper because he needed something to do with his hands, something to tend, something that would grow under his care instead of dying. And then his son had enlisted. And then his son had deployed. And then his son had come home in a box draped with the same flag that had covered Jimmy Dalton 50 years before. The smell of fresh-cut boxwood brought Earl back to the present. His hands were still moving on the hedge, still shaping, still tending. The ceremony continued behind him. Madison had retreated a few steps, her phone pressed to her ear now, talking to someone about logistics for the reception afterward. But she had not left, and she had not stopped watching him. Earl could feel her eyes on his back, could sense the questions forming in her mind. She did not understand him. He did not fit the categories she had constructed, the neat boxes of victim and hero and charity case that made her worldview comprehensible. He was something else, something that did not compute. Good, he thought. Let her wonder. The memorial wall rose behind the stage, black granite gleaming in the November sun. Earl knew every name on that wall. He had traced them with his fingers in the early morning hours when no one was watching, had whispered them into the silence like prayers for the dead. But one name he knew better than all the others. One name he had touched so many times that the granite had grown smooth beneath his fingertips. Sergeant First Class Michael David Whitmore. Operation Iraqi Freedom. March 2005. His son. His boy. The child he had held in the delivery room and promised to protect. The teenager he had taught to drive and to shoot and to stand up straight when addressed by his elders. The young man who had looked at his father's medals one night and asked why he never wore them, and Earl had not known how to explain that some honors weigh too much to display. Michael had earned his own honors. A Bronze Star for valor, a Purple Heart posthumous, a flag folded 13 times and presented to Earl by a colonel who could not meet his eyes. Earl had taken the job at this university 3 months after the funeral. He had not told anyone why. He had simply shown up at the facility's office and asked if they needed a groundskeeper, and when they said yes, he had started the next morning. For 22 years, he had tended these grounds, had shaped these hedges, had kept the memorial garden pristine and the grass around his son's name trimmed to regulation height. No one had ever asked why the groundskeeper spent so much time near the memorial wall. No one had ever noticed the old man standing alone at dawn, his hand pressed flat against the granite, his lips moving in conversations only the dead could hear. But today, for the first time in 22 years, someone was about to notice. Professor Okonkwo was 30 feet away now, moving through the crowd with purpose, his phone clutched in his hand and his face pale with the shock of recognition. Tommy Reeves was approaching from the other direction, drawn by instinct and inheritance toward a truth he could not yet name. And Madison Chun stood frozen near the hedgerow, watching it all unfold, not understanding that the old man she had tried to help was about to teach her what sacrifice really meant. Professor Okonkwo stopped 10 feet from the hedgerow. His legs would not carry him further. The photograph on his phone screen glowed with the face of a young sergeant from 1969, and the old man trimming the hedge in front of him wore that same face weathered by 50 years of living with what that young sergeant had done. It was not possible. David had spent 3 decades studying the Battle of Hamburger Hill. He had walked the ground where it happened, had stood on the slope of Dong Apia, and tried to imagine what it must have been like to climb that gradient under fire. He had interviewed survivors and collected documents and written a chapter that was required reading at West Point. And in all that time, in all those years of research and correspondence and careful scholarship, no one had ever mentioned that the shepherd of Hamburger Hill lived here, in this town, tending the grounds of this university like a monk tending a garden. The old man had not looked up. His hands continued their work on the hedge, steady and precise, as if he did not notice the professor standing frozen nearby, or the young ROTC cadet approaching from the opposite direction, or the girl with the clipboard who had finally ended her phone call and was watching everything with growing confusion. Madison stepped forward. She had sensed that something was happening, some shift in the atmosphere that she could not explain. The professor looked like he had seen a ghost. The ROTC kid looked like he was approaching a commanding officer. And the groundskeeper just kept trimming, kept shaping, kept his back turned to all of them as if none of it mattered. "Excuse me," Madison said, addressing Professor Okonkwo. "Is everything okay? Do you know this man?" David opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. How could he explain? How could he tell this student that the man she had been patronizing for the past 20 minutes was one of the most decorated soldiers of the Vietnam War? That his actions on Hamburger Hill were studied in military academies around the world? That the 4 men he carried down that mountain had gone on to live full lives, to have children and grandchildren, to grow old in a country that had largely forgotten the war that nearly killed them? Tommy Reeves reached the hedgerow first. He stopped at the position of attention, his instincts overriding his uncertainty. Something about the old man demanded military bearing. Something in the way he held himself, the way he moved, the way he stood with his weight balanced and his shoulders square despite the stoop of age. "Sir," Tommy said. The word came out before he could stop it. Earl turned. He looked at the young man in the ROTC uniform, at the ribbons on his chest and the brass on his collar, and the earnest confusion in his eyes. He looked at the professor, standing pale and trembling with a phone in his hand. He looked at Madison, who had finally stopped talking and was simply staring. "Can I help you?" Earl said. Tommy swallowed. He did not know what to say. He had approached on instinct, drawn by something he could not name, and now he stood face to face with a man whose eyes held depths he could not fathom. "My grandfather served in Vietnam," Tommy said. He never talked about it, but he had this look sometimes, like he was somewhere else, like part of him never came home. Earl nodded slowly. "A lot of us have that look," he said. The ceremony had reached its conclusion. The retired colonel was thanking the crowd for attending, inviting them to the reception in the student union. People were beginning to stand, to stretch, to gather their belongings and drift toward the exits. But near the hedgerow, time had stopped. Professor Okonkwo found his voice. It emerged cracked and barely audible, a whisper that carried more weight than any lecture he had ever delivered. "Staff Sergeant Whitmore," he said. Earl went very still. His hands stopped moving on the trimmer. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He did not turn to face the professor, but his posture shifted, straightened, as if some part of him had snapped to attention without conscious thought. "Sir," David continued, his voice strengthening, "I have studied Hamburger Hill for 30 years. I have corresponded with Rodriguez and Hawkins and Pemberton. I have a photograph of you on my office wall. I have read the after-action reports and the medal citations and the letters those men wrote to the Army commending your actions. And I have walked past you every single morning for 15 years without knowing who you were." Madison's face had gone pale. She looked from the professor to the groundskeeper and back again, her mind struggling to reconcile the man she had been lecturing about veterans with the possibility that he might be one himself. "I do not understand," she said. "What are you talking about? What photograph?" David held up his phone. The screen showed a black and white image, grainy with age, of a young sergeant in torn fatigues. He was carrying a body across his shoulders. Behind him, 4 men limped and crawled through jungle darkness. The caption beneath the image read, "Staff Sergeant Earl Whitmore, the shepherd of Hamburger Hill, leads wounded soldiers to extraction point after 14-hour descent under enemy fire. May 1969. Madison looked at the photograph. She looked at the groundskeeper. The shape of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the eyes that held something ancient and unbreakable. "That is not," she started. She stopped. She looked again. "That cannot be." Earl finally turned to face them fully. He set down the hedge trimmer with the careful deliberation of a man who has learned that rushed movements get people killed. His hand moved to his pocket, to the worn velvet case he had carried every Veterans Day for 50 years. "I came here to tend the grounds," he said quietly, "not to be recognized." But Professor Okonkwo was already shaking his head. "Sir," he said, and his voice cracked on the word, "with profound respect, you do not get to decide that. Not today. Not after what you did." The crowd was dispersing around them, streams of people flowing toward the student union, but a small cluster had begun to form near the hedgerow. People who had noticed the ROTC cadet standing at attention. People who had seen the professor's trembling hands. People who sensed that something was happening here, something that demanded witness. And Earl Whitmore stood among them, his hand still resting on the velvet case in his pocket, knowing that the walls he had built over 50 years were about to come down. The crowd was growing. Word had begun to spread in that invisible way that information travels through groups of people, passed from mouth to ear in whispers and nudges and pointed glances. Something was happening near the hedgerow, something involving the old groundskeeper and a professor and an ROTC cadet standing at attention. Madison had not moved. She stood rooted to the spot where certainties had begun to crumble, her clipboard hanging forgotten at her side, her eyes fixed on the face of a man she had been explaining the Vietnam War to 15 minutes ago. The photograph on Professor Okonkwo's phone was still visible, held up like evidence in a trial. The young sergeant in the image stared out across 50 years of history, his face gaunt with exhaustion, his eyes burning with the kind of determination that does not ask permission or accept defeat. The body across his shoulders was limp and still. The men behind him were broken but alive, and the old man standing in front of the hedge wore that same face, weathered now, lined with age and loss and the particular gravity of a life spent carrying weights that most people could not imagine. "I think there has been some kind of mistake," Madison said. Her voice came out thin and uncertain, nothing like the confident tone she had used to lecture Earl about trauma and sacrifice. "This is just, he's the groundskeeper. He trims the hedges." Professor Okonkwo turned to look at her. There was no anger in his expression, only a profound weariness that seemed to settle over his features like a mask. "Miss Chun," he said, "I have spent 30 years studying what this man did. I have read the testimonies of the soldiers he saved. I have stood on the hill where he should have died and tried to understand how any human being could do what he did. And you are telling me he trims hedges." Madison flinched as if struck. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Tommy Reeves had not broken his position of attention. His eyes remained fixed on Earl, taking in every detail. The way the old man's hands hung loose at his sides, ready. The way his weight was distributed, balanced. The way his breathing had slowed and steadied as the crowd gathered around him. These were not the habits of a groundskeeper. These were the habits of a soldier. Tommy's grandfather had moved the same way, had carried himself with the same unconscious readiness, even in his 70s, even when the war was 3 decades behind him. "Sir," Tommy said again, "if I may ask, why did you never tell anyone?" Earl considered the question. Around him, the crowd continued to swell. Faculty members in academic regalia, students drawn by curiosity, a few older men and women who moved with the careful deliberation of people who understood what was happening here, who recognized the weight of the moment, even if they did not yet know the details. "Because it was not anyone's business," Earl said finally. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Because the men I serve with did not need my stories. They needed me to come to work every day and do my job and not make a fuss. Because the ones that did not make it home deserved to be remembered for who they were, not for how they died." He paused. His hand moved to his pocket again, fingers finding the velvet case. "And because I took this job to be close to my son," he said, "not to be thanked for something I did before he was born." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ripples of confusion moved through the crowd. So, the groundskeeper had a son. Had a son, past tense, which meant something else entirely. Professor Okonkwo's face changed. The scholarly excitement that had driven him across the quad was giving way to something deeper, something that recognized the full weight of what Earl Whitmore had been carrying for 22 years. "Your son," David said softly. "He is on the wall." It was not a question. Earl nodded once, a small movement that cost him more than anyone watching could understand. "Sergeant First Class Michael Whitmore," Earl said. 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment. He deployed to Iraq in January 2005. He had not come home. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the campus seemed to fade, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Madison's hand had risen to cover her mouth. Tears were forming in her eyes, tears of shame and recognition, and the sudden understanding of how badly she had misjudged the man standing in front of her. Tommy Reeves felt his throat tighten. The 187th Infantry Regiment, the Rakkasans, his grandfather's unit in Vietnam, reborn for a new war, carrying the same legacy of sacrifice into a different jungle. And Professor Okonkwo simply stood, his phone lowering to his side, the photograph of a young sergeant replaced by the reality of an old man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. Earl reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around the velvet case he had carried for 50 years, had touched every morning, had never shown to anyone since the day they pinned it on his chest in a ceremony he barely remembered. He pulled it out. The case was worn soft with age. The velvet faded to something between purple and gray. He held it in his palm for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the impossible weight of a small piece of metal that represented 14 hours of darkness and 4 men saved and 1 man lost. "You want to know about sacrifice?" Earl said, looking at Madison. "You want to understand what veterans went through." He opened the case. The silver star caught the November light, its rays gleaming against the tarnished surface, its ribbon faded but intact. "This is what it looks like," he said. "This is what it costs. And I have carried it in my pocket every Veterans Day for 50 years because I could not bear to put on display. Because every time I look at it, I see the face of the man who should have received it instead of me." His voice broke on the last word. For the first time since the conversation began, something cracked in Earl Whitmore's composure. Something human and fragile showed through the armor of 50 years. And the crowd stood witness, silent and shaken, as the groundskeeper held out the weight of his service for all of them to see. The silver star sat in Earl's weathered palm like a small sun, its 5 points catching light that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the November sky. Around him, the crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, drawn by the gravity of the moment, by the whispered explanations passing from those who understood to those who did not. "That is a silver star," someone said. A woman in faculty regalia, her voice carrying the hushed reverence of someone who knew what the medal meant. "Third highest combat decoration," another voice added. A man in his 60s wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap, his eyes fixed on the medal with recognition. "You do not get that for showing up." Earl did not acknowledge the comments. His attention had turned inward to a place 50 years and half a world away, where a young sergeant had made a choice that would define the rest of his life. "Jimmy wanted to be a teacher," Earl said. His voice was steady now, the crack in his composure sealed over with the discipline of decades. He talked about it all the time, going to use his GI Bill, get a degree in history, coach football at some high school in Texas. He had it all planned out. The crowd pressed closer, straining to hear. Madison had not moved from her spot near the hedgerow. Tears ran freely down her face now, cutting tracks through her careful makeup, but she made no move to wipe them away. "We were pinned down on that hill for 6 days before the final assault," Earl continued. 6 days of climbing and dying and climbing again. By the 10th day, half my squad was gone. The ones who were left were running on nothing but stubbornness and the belief that if we just made it to the top, it would mean something. He paused. His thumb traced the edge of the silver star, following the contours of a shape he had memorized through touch alone. Jimmy was on point when we finally broke through. He was always on point. Fastest reflexes in the platoon, eyes like a hawk. He saw the RPG team before anyone else did. Saw them setting up in a spider hole we had cleared twice already. Earl's jaw tightened. The memory was coming now, whether he wanted it to or not, rising up from the place where he had buried it, demanding to be spoken. He should have called it out. Should have dropped and let me take the shot. That was protocol. That was what I had trained him to do. But Jimmy knew something I did not know. He knew that the angle was wrong. He knew that if he dropped, the rocket would take me and the 4 men behind me. So he stepped left instead of right, put himself between the blast and his sergeant. A sound escaped from somewhere in the crowd. A sob quickly stifled. Tommy Reeves had gone pale, his position of attention wavering as the weight of the story pressed down on him. The rocket hit him center mass. Earl said. Should have killed him instantly. But Jimmy was stubborn. Always was. He held on long enough for me to reach him. Long enough to look me in the eye and tell me to get the others down the mountain. Earl closed his fist around the silver star. When he opened it again, his palm bore the imprint of its points, 5 small indentations in flesh that had carried this weight for half a century. So I did, he said. I put him across my shoulders and I started walking. Rodriguez had taken shrapnel in both legs. Hawkins had a collapsed lung. Pemberton was shot through the arm. Yates had a head wound that should have killed him. And Jimmy was dead before we made it 100 meters. The silence was so complete that Earl could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the pulse of blood through veins that had somehow kept pumping for 50 years after that night. I could have left him, Earl said. The dead do not care where they lie. I could have put him down and moved faster, gotten the living to safety, come back for him later. That is what the manual says to do. That is what any rational person would have done. He looked up at the crowd gathered around him, looked at their faces wet with tears, tight with emotion, looked at Madison, who had finally understood something that no textbook or awareness campaign could teach. But Shepard does not leave anyone behind, Earl said. That is what Jimmy told me once. Shepard gets them home. All of them. So I carried him. 14 hours through jungle so thick you could not see the sky. 14 hours with enemy fire coming from every direction. 14 hours with 4 broken men following me because they believed I could get them out. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. And I did. I got them out. All 5 of them. 4 to the hospital ship, 1 to the morgue. And they gave me this medal and told me I was a hero. And I have never once felt like anything but a man who watched his best friend die because he could not see a spider hole that had already been cleared twice. Earl looked down at the silver star in his hand. 50 years of wait. 50 years of carrying a dead man down a mountain that never ended. So no, Miss Chun, he said, looking at Madison for the first time since he had begun speaking. I do not want to sit in your ceremony. I do not want to be thanked for my sacrifice. I want to trim this hedge and tend this garden and stand near my son's name on that wall. Because that is all I have left. That is all any of us have left. He closed the velvet case with a soft click. The silver star disappeared from view, returned to the pocket where it had lived for 50 years. And the crowd stood frozen, bearing witness to a grief that no amount of time could heal. The retired colonel who had given the keynote address was pushing through the crowd. His name was Colonel Marcus Webb, and he had spent 35 years in the Army before retiring to teach military history at the university. He had delivered the same Veterans Day speech, with minor variations, for the past 7 years. He had spoken about Hamburger Hill as a historical event, a case study in perseverance and sacrifice, never once imagining that the man who had defined that battle was listening from behind a hedgerow 50 yards away. Make way, Colonel Webb said, his command voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Let me through. The crowd parted. Webb emerged into the small clearing that had formed around Earl Whitmore, his eyes taking in the scene with the rapid assessment of a man trained to read situations in a glance. The old groundskeeper standing with quiet dignity. The young woman with tears streaming down her face. The professor clutching his phone. The ROTC cadet still holding something close to attention. And in the groundskeeper's hand, just visible before it disappeared into his pocket, the unmistakable glint of a silver star. Colonel Webb stopped. His posture changed. The professional bearing of a keynote speaker gave way to something older and deeper, something that transcended rank and protocol and all the careful ceremonies of military life. Staff Sergeant Whitmore, he said. His voice had lost its command edge. It came out soft, almost reverent. I taught your action at the Command and General Staff College for 12 years. Every officer who passed through those doors learned what you did on Hill 937. Earl met his gaze. 2 soldiers, separated by decades and rank, and the vast gulf between a legend and the man who studied it, standing face to face in the November light. Then you know it was not just me, Earl said. It was Jimmy. It was Rodriguez and Hawkins and Pemberton and Yates. It was every man who climbed that hill and did not come back down. Colonel Webb nodded slowly. He understood. He had spent enough time with combat veterans to know that the ones who had seen the worst were often the ones who said the least. That heroism and humility were not opposites, but two faces of the same coin. I know, Webb said, but with respect, Sergeant, you do not get to diminish what you did. Those 4 men lived because of you. They had families, children, grandchildren, an entire lineage that exists because one man refused to leave them behind. Earl's jaw tightened. He had heard these words before, in letters and phone calls, and the occasional visit from men who had grown old, carrying the memory of a night when they should have died. He had never known how to respond to them. The math did not work in his head. 4 men saved against 1 man lost. The equation never balanced. Sergeant Whitmore. A new voice. Earl turned to find a woman approaching through the crowd. She was perhaps 60 years old, dressed in the conservative attire of university administration, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she moved with the careful purpose of someone fighting to maintain composure. "My name is Patricia Holloway," she said. "I am the Dean of Students. I have worked at this university for 28 years, and I have passed you nearly every day of those years without knowing who you were." She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "My father served in Korea," she said. "He never talked about it either. He came home with a Bronze Star and nightmares that lasted until the day he died. And I spent my whole life wishing he had told me, wishing I had understood what he carried, wishing I had known him as more than just a quiet man who flinched at loud noises and woke up screaming in the night." Her voice broke. She paused, gathered herself, continued. "I have watched you tend these grounds for almost 3 decades. I have seen you standing at the memorial wall at dawn when you thought no one was looking. I have wondered about you, Sergeant Whitmore. I have wondered what your story was. And now I know." She reached out and took his hand. The gesture was gentle, almost maternal, the kind of touch that asks nothing and offers everything. "I know your son is on that wall," she said. "I know you took this job to be close to him. And I want you to know that for 22 years, you have been honoring him in the most profound way a father can. By showing up, by tending the ground where his name is carved, by refusing to forget." Earl's composure, which had held through the story of Jimmy's death and the revelation of the Silver Star, began to fracture. His hand trembled in Dean Holloway's grip. His eyes, which had remained dry through 50 years of carrying the weight, grew bright with moisture. "I just wanted to be near him," Earl said. His voice was barely a whisper now. "I just wanted to make sure the grass around his name was always trimmed, that the flowers were always fresh, that someone remembered." Dean Holloway squeezed his hand. "Someone does," she said. "Every day someone does." The crowd had grown larger still. Word had spread across the quad, into the student union, through the clusters of people making their way to the reception. The Veterans Day ceremony had ended, but something more important had begun, something unscripted and unrehearsed, and more powerful than any speech could ever be. And at the center of it all stood Earl Whitmore, a groundskeeper with a silver star in his pocket and a son's name carved in granite, finally allowing himself to be seen after 50 years of hiding in plain sight. The man in the Vietnam veteran's cap had worked his way to the front of the crowd. He was perhaps 70 years old, his face weathered by time and sun and the particular erosion that comes from carrying memories too heavy for one lifetime. His cap bore the insignia of the 101st Airborne Division, and beneath it his eyes were wet with tears he did not bother to hide. "Shepard," he said. The word came out broken, half whisper and half prayer. Earl turned to face him. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that traveled across 50 years like lightning through clouds. The man's hands were shaking as he reached up to remove his cap, revealing a scalp scarred with the unmistakable pattern of old shrapnel wounds. "A head wound that should have killed him," Earl had said. "Yates had a head wound that should have killed him. You probably do not remember me," the man said. His voice cracked on every other word. "There were a lot of us on that hill. A lot of faces. A lot of names." Earl stared at him. His own hands had begun to tremble. "Bobby," Earl said. "Bobby Yates." The man let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob. He nodded, tears streaming freely now, his cap clutched against his chest like a shield. "You carried me down that mountain," Bobby Yates said. "I was unconscious for most of it. Woke up on a medevac with no idea how I got there. They told me later. Told me about you and Jimmy and the 14 hours. But by the time I was out of the hospital, you had already rotated home. I never got to thank you." The crowd had gone completely still. Even the ambient sounds of the campus seemed to have faded, leaving only the two men facing each other across a gulf of decades. "I looked for you," Bobby continued. "For years I looked. Wrote to the Army, wrote to the VA, wrote to anyone I could think of. They told me your records were sealed. Some kind of administrative error. They could not tell me where you were." Earl shook his head slowly. His voice, when it came, was thick with emotion. "I did not want to be found," he said. "After I came home, after Jimmy's funeral, I just wanted to disappear. I thought if I could be invisible, maybe the guilt would stop. Maybe I could stop seeing his face every time I closed my eyes." Bobby Yates stepped forward. Without hesitation, without asking permission, he wrapped his arms around Earl Whitmore and held on like a man clinging to a life raft in a storm. "You saved my life," Bobby whispered into Earl's shoulder. "I have a daughter, 3 grandchildren, a great-granddaughter born last spring. They all exist because of you, because you would not leave me on that mountain." Earl stood rigid for a moment, his arms hanging at his sides, his body unaccustomed to this kind of contact. Then something broke loose inside him. His arms came up slowly, wrapping around the man he had carried through the darkness 50 years ago, and he held on with the same stubborn refusal to let go that had brought them both down the mountain alive. The crowd watched in silence. Madison Chun had sunk to her knees on the grass, her clipboard abandoned, her hands pressed over her mouth as sobs shook her body. Tommy Reeves had finally broken his position of attention, tears cutting tracks down his young face. Professor Okonkwo had removed his glasses and was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Colonel Webb stood at attention and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. One by one, others followed. The faculty members in their academic regalia, the students who had wandered over out of curiosity, the older veterans scattered through the crowd, men and women who understood what they were witnessing even if they had not been there. Hands rose to foreheads and hearts and remained there, a silent tribute to two men who had survived the unsurvivable and found each other again after half a century. Bobby pulled back from the embrace, but he kept his hands on Earl's shoulders, refusing to break contact entirely. "Rodriguez is still alive," Bobby said. "Lives in Tucson now. Retired principal, just like he always wanted. Hawkins passed in Ohio, heart attack, but his wife still writes to me every Christmas. Pemberton is in a nursing home in Virginia, but his mind is still sharp. They all know what you did, Earl. They all remember." Earl's face had transformed. The careful mask he had worn for 50 years had crumbled completely, revealing something raw and vulnerable and profoundly human underneath. "I thought I was the only one left," he said. "I thought everyone had moved on. Forgotten." Bobby shook his head fiercely. "Forgotten? We named our children after you, Earl. Rodriguez has a son named Earl. Hawkins had a grandson named Whitmore. We have been carrying you with us every single day since that mountain. How would you think we forgot?" Earl had no answer. He stood in the center of the crowd, surrounded by witnesses, held upright by a man whose life he had saved, and let the tears come. 50 years of grief, 50 years of guilt, 50 years of believing that what he had done was not enough, could never be enough, would never balance the weight of the man he had lost. And for the first time since that night on the mountain, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it had meant something after all. The crowd had swelled to over 100 people now. They stood in concentric rings around the hedgerow where Earl Whitmore had spent 22 years trimming boxwood and keeping secrets. Faculty and students and staff and visitors who had come for a routine Veterans Day ceremony and stumbled into something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Bobby Yates had not released his grip on Earl's shoulder. He stood beside his sergeant like a soldier retaking a position he had held 50 years ago, and his presence seemed to give Earl the strength to remain standing when everything in him wanted to collapse. Professor Okonkwo stepped forward. He had regained some of his composure, though his voice still trembled when he spoke. "Sergeant Whitmore," he said, "with your permission, I would like to tell these people what you did. Not the version I have taught in classrooms for 30 years. The real version. The one that does not fit in textbooks." Earl looked at him. The mask was gone now, stripped away by Bobby's embrace and the weight of being seen after so long in the shadows. What remained was simply a man, old and tired, and carrying more than any one person should ever have to carry. "I do not need recognition, Professor," Earl said. "I never did." Bobby's hand tightened on his shoulder. "It is not about what you need, Shepard. It is about what they need." He gestured at the crowd, at the young faces and old faces, at Madison Chin still kneeling on the grass with mascara streaking her cheeks. They need to know what sacrifice really looks like, not the stuff they put on posters and bumper stickers. The real thing. Earl was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded, a single small movement of his head that granted permission for a story he had kept locked away for half a century. Professor Okonkwo turned to face the crowd. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The silence was so complete that a whisper would have carried to the back row. On May 20th, 1969, David began. Staff Sergeant Earl Whitmore was leading a 12-man squad up Hill 937 in the A Shau Valley of Vietnam. It was the 11th assault on a position that had already cost over 70 American lives. By the time they reached the summit, only 6 members of his squad were still standing. He paused, letting the numbers settle over the crowd. During the assault, an RPG struck Corporal James Dalton, Sergeant Whitmore's point man and closest friend. The blast also wounded 4 other soldiers. With enemy fire intensifying and no possibility of air evacuation, Sergeant Whitmore made a decision that defied every tactical calculation in the Army manual. David's voice grew quieter, forcing the crowd to lean in. He picked up Corporal Dalton's body, put it across his shoulders, and he began walking down the mountain. 800 meters of vertical jungle. 14 hours of continuous movement under enemy fire. For wounded soldiers following behind him because they believed that if anyone could get them out alive, it was Shepard. Bobby Yates spoke up, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "I was one of those 4. I had shrapnel in my skull. I should have been dead. But every time I started to fall behind, Earl came back for me, picked me up, carried me until I could walk again, then went back for the others." He was not speaking to the crowd anymore. He was speaking to Earl, looking directly into the eyes of the man who had refused to leave him behind. "I remember waking up once during the descent," Bobby said. "It was still dark. I could hear gunfire everywhere, and I could see Earl's face above me, covered in sweat and blood and mud, and he was talking to Jimmy, talking to a dead man like he was still alive, telling him to hold on, telling him they were almost there." Earl's eyes closed. The memory washed over him, as fresh and raw as if it had happened yesterday. Jimmy's weight across his shoulders, the smell of blood and cordite, the sound of his own voice making promises to a man who could no longer hear them. When a medevac finally arrived at dawn, Professor Okonkwo continued. Sergeant Whitmore had been moving for 14 hours straight. He had carried a dead man and 4 wounded soldiers through 800 meters of hostile jungle. He had not slept. He had not stopped. He had not left anyone behind. David turned to look at Earl. The Army awarded him the Silver Star for gallantry in action. But what the citation does not mention is that Earl Whitmore never recovered from that night. He came home to a country that did not understand what he had done. He buried his best friend in Texas and never spoke of the war again. He raised a son who followed him into service and died in Iraq in 2005. And then he took a job as a groundskeeper at this university, so he could spend every day near the wall where his son's name is carved. The crowd was weeping openly now. Students who had never known war. Faculty who had only read about it. Veterans who understood all too well. All of them united in this moment by the story of a man who had given everything and asked for nothing. Earl opened his eyes. He looked at the faces surrounding him, wet with tears, raw with emotion. He looked at Bobby Yates, still standing at his shoulder. He looked at the memorial wall rising behind the stage, at the name he had touched 10,000 times in the pre-dawn darkness. Jimmy used to say that the measure of a man is not what he does when people are watching, Earl said. His voice was hoarse but steady. It is what he does when no one can see, when there is no medal waiting, no parade, no ceremony, just the choice between leaving someone behind and carrying them home. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver star one more time, held it up so the crowd could see. This belongs to him, Earl said. It always did. I just carried it for a while, the same way I carried him down that mountain, because that is what brothers do. Madison Chen rose slowly from her knees. Her legs felt uncertain beneath her, as if the ground itself had shifted during the past hour, and she was still learning how to stand on this new terrain. Her clipboard lay forgotten on the grass. Her phone had run out of storage 20 minutes ago, still trying to record something that could never be captured by a camera. She took one step toward Earl, then another. The crowd parted for her, recognizing that something needed to happen between these two people, something that could not be witnessed from a distance. Earl watched her approach. His face bore no anger, no resentment, no trace of the judgment she deserved. He simply waited, the way he had waited on that mountain 50 years ago, patient and steady and ready for whatever came next. Madison stopped in front of him. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words that had always come so easily to her, the speeches and slogans and carefully rehearsed phrases, had abandoned her completely. What emerged instead was something raw and unpolished and more honest than anything she had ever said. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry for everything I said, for talking to you like you did not know, for assuming, for being so certain that I understood something I knew nothing about." The tears came again, fresh waves of shame and recognition that she did not try to stop. "I have spent 3 years running a veteran support club," she said. 3 years raising money and posting on social media and talking about sacrifice like I had any idea what the word meant. And the whole time, you were here, right here, trimming hedges, and I walked past you 100 times without seeing you. Earl reached out and took her hand. The gesture was gentle, almost fatherly, the touch of a man who had spent 50 years learning that anger solved nothing, and that grace was the only response to ignorance that did not perpetuate more pain. "You could not have known," Earl said. "I did not want you to know. That was the whole point." Madison shook her head fiercely. "That is not an excuse. I should have asked. I should have listened instead of talked. I should have treated you like a person instead of a cause." Earl looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, a softening that surprised even him. "Then start now," he said. "You want to support veterans? Do not raise money for us. Do not post about us. Just see us. Sit with us. Listen to the stories we are willing to tell and respect the ones we are not. That is what we need. Not charity, not pity, just someone who is willing to be present without an agenda." Madison nodded, absorbing the words like medicine for a wound she had not known she carried. Behind her, Tommy Reeves stepped forward. He had finally broken his parade rest, his young face streaked with tears, his hands hanging loose at his sides. He stopped beside Madison and faced Earl with the earnest uncertainty of someone standing at the edge of a decision that would shape his life. "Sergeant Whitmore," Tommy said. His voice cracked on the name. "I joined ROTC because of my grandfather. He never talked about Vietnam, but I always knew it was part of him, part of me. I wanted to understand." Earl studied the young man, saw the echo of 100 soldiers he had known, young and eager and burning with something they could not name. "And do you," Earl asked, "understand?" Tommy shook his head slowly. "No, sir. I thought I did. But after today, I realize I do not know anything. I do not know what it costs. I do not know what it takes. I do not know if I have what you have." Earl reached out and placed his hand on Tommy's shoulder. The touch was firm and steady, the grip of a man who had held dying soldiers and carried dead friends and never once let go when it mattered. "Nobody knows," Earl said. "Not until the moment comes. And when it does, you find out who you are. You find out what you are willing to carry and how far you are willing to go. That is not something you can learn in a classroom. It is something you discover in the dark, when everything is falling apart and the only thing left is the choice to keep moving or give up." He paused, his eyes distant for a moment, seeing a mountain half a world and half a century away. I did not know I could carry 5 men down that hill, Earl continued. I did not know I had that in me until I had to find out. And the truth is, I still do not know if what I did was courage or just stubbornness. Maybe there is no difference. Tommy straightened slightly, drawing strength from the hand on his shoulder. I want to serve, he said. I want to matter. I want to be the kind of person who does not leave anyone behind. Earl nodded slowly. Then remember this day. Remember what you saw here. And when your moment comes, when you're standing in the dark with impossible choices in front of you, remember that you already have everything you need. The only question is whether you are willing to use it. He released Tommy's shoulder and turned to face the crowd one final time. Over 100 faces looked back at him, transformed by an hour they had not expected, carrying a story they would never forget. I came here today to trim a hedge, Earl said. His voice carried across the silent quad, steady and clear. I did not ask for this. I did not want it. But maybe that is not the point. Maybe some stories need to be told not for the person who lived them, but for the people who need to hear them. He looked at Bobby Yates, still standing at his shoulder. He looked at Madison, humbled and raw. He looked at Tommy, burning with new purpose. He looked at the memorial wall, where his son's name was carved in granite. So hear this, Earl said. Every veteran you pass on the street, every old man trimming hedges or driving a bus or sitting alone on a park bench, might be carrying a story like mine, or heavier, or darker. You will never know unless you ask. And even if you ask, they might not tell you. But that does not mean the story is not there. It just means they have decided to carry it alone. His hand moved to his pocket, to the velvet case that held 50 years of weight. So do not pity us, he said. Do not thank us with words that cost you nothing. Just see us. That is enough. That has always been enough. 3 months later, the first crocuses pushed through the soil around the memorial wall. Purple and white and yellow. They emerged in careful rows that had been planted in October by hands that knew exactly how deep to set the bulbs and exactly how much space to leave between them. Earl Whitmore knelt in the garden at dawn, the way he had knelt every morning for 22 years. But something was different now. The weight he carried had not disappeared, would never disappear, but it had shifted somehow. Redistributed, shared. A bench sat 10 feet from the memorial wall, installed by the university in December over Earl's objections. He had not wanted recognition. He had not wanted his name on a plaque. But Dean Holloway had insisted, and Bobby Yates had flown in from California to add his voice to hers. And in the end, Earl had relented because he had learned, finally, that some battles were not worth fighting. The plaque on the bench was small. It read simply, "For the shepherds who carry us home." Earl rose from the garden and walked to the bench. His knees ached with a particular complaint of old injuries aggravated by cold mornings, but he did not mind. The ache meant he was still here, still moving, still tending. He sat down and looked at the wall. His son's name caught the first light of morning, the letters carved deep into the granite, permanent and unchangeable. Sergeant First Class Michael David Whitmore, 27 years old when he died. Younger than Earl had been on Hamburger Hill. Younger than Jimmy had been when he stepped left instead of right. "Hey, Mike," Earl said softly. "Spring is coming. Your mother's crocuses are blooming. Remember how she used to make us plant them every fall? You complained every single time, said it was pointless because we would not see them until spring. But she knew. She always knew that the things we plant in darkness are the things that matter most." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet case. The silver star gleamed in the early light, its 5 points as sharp as the day it was minted. Earl had thought about giving it away, had thought about donating it to a museum or sending it to Jimmy's family in Texas. But in the end, he had kept it, not as a trophy, not as a reminder of what he had done, but as a promise to keep carrying what needed to be carried. Footsteps on the path behind him. Earl did not turn. He knew the sound of those footsteps by now, had learned them over 3 months of early mornings and shared silences. Madison Chun sat down on the bench beside him. She did not speak. She had learned that lesson in the months since Veterans Day, had learned that presence did not require words, and that sometimes the most profound conversations happened in silence. She came twice a week now, always at dawn, always before her classes began. She brought coffee sometimes, 2 cups from the shop on College Avenue, and they would sit together and watch the sun rise over the memorial wall. She never asked about the war. She never asked about Michael or Jimmy or the mountain. She just sat, and in that sitting, she offered something more valuable than all the fundraisers and awareness campaigns she had ever organized. Tommy Reeves appeared a few minutes later, still in his ROTC uniform, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He had taken to visiting the memorial before morning PT, had made it part of his routine the way Earl had made it part of his. He nodded at Earl and Madison, then walked to the wall and stood at attention in front of a name Earl did not recognize. His grandfather, Madison whispered. He found out he is on the wall too. Different section, different war, but still here. Earl nodded. The wall had a way of connecting people across time, across generations, across the vast gulf between those who had served and those who had not. It was not just a list of names. It was a family tree of sacrifice, its branches extending backward and forward through history. Professor Okonkwo had visited twice since Veterans Day. He was writing a new chapter for his book, one that included Earl's story told in Earl's own words. Earl had resisted at first, had insisted that his story was not special, that thousands of men had done what he had done without recognition or reward. But David had pointed out that the story was not about Earl alone. It was about Jimmy and Rodriguez and Hawkins and Pemberton and Yates. It was about Michael. It was about every soldier who had ever carried a brother home. Bobby Yates called every Sunday now. They talked for hours sometimes, filling in the gaps of 50 years, sharing memories of men who had not made it home and men who had. Bobby was planning a reunion for the survivors, a gathering in Texas at Jimmy's grave where they could finally say goodbye together. Earl had agreed to go. It would be the first time he had visited Jimmy's grave since the funeral. The first time he had stood on Texas soil since he watched them lower his best friend into the ground. But he was ready now, ready to finish the journey he had started on that mountain, ready to put down the weight he had carried for 50 years, if only for a moment. The sun cleared the horizon, spilling gold across the memorial wall. Earl watched the light move across his son's name, illuminating each letter, making the granite glow like something alive. "Still here, Mike," he whispered. "Still tending the garden. And I am not alone anymore." Turns out, there were people waiting to help carry the weight. I just had to let them. He closed the velvet case and returned it to his pocket. The silver star would stay with him until the end, a reminder of what he had done and what it had cost and what it had meant. But it was not a burden anymore. It was simply part of him, like the scars on his hands and the memories in his heart and the love he carried for a son he would see again someday. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in the quietest disguises, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And before you go, tell us in the comments, who is the quiet hero in your life? Who carries their service in silence, asking nothing, expecting nothing, simply showing up every day to tend the garden? Because they are out there, on every street, in every town, trimming hedges and driving buses and sitting alone on park benches. And they do not need our pity or our parades. They just need us to see them. Earl Whitmore rose from the bench as the campus began to wake around him. He had hedges to trim, gardens to tend, a wall to watch over. And for the first time in 50 years, he did not carry the weight alone.